Bleach as a story has some very underrated writing in my opinion, and I'm sure if you clicked on this video you would agree. And the chapter of the manga which is a favorite among many Bleach fans, including myself, is The Blade Is Me. And while I say that Bleach has very underrated writing, that's not to say that I consider myself some kind of narrative analysis god or anything, but if you've been watching Bleach videos for any length of time, I think you'll agree that there are a lot of overlooked aspects of the story, especially when it comes to the character of Ichigo Kurosaki and his Zanpakuto Zangetsu. Now, this video is going to be part 1 of a 2-part series. Depending on when you're watching this, part 2 will already be on my channel, but if you're watching this video anytime before then part 2 will be out within the next week. And if you'd be so kind, I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe. Any bit of support really goes a long way. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, and it would take mere seconds to like and subscribe. I also have a Patreon where I'm going to upload this video so you can watch it ad-free, and with that out of the way, let's get started. Zanpakuto, Asauchi, and Bankai are one of the more popular aspects of Bleach. I mean, I'm sure you can agree that a cool sword turning into a much cooler sword is one of the best parts of the series. But beyond just the spectacle of the ability, the Zanpakuto, narratively, is an amazing way to show the true nature of the person wielding it, how they act, how they see themselves as a person, and the way that character is personified in the series, at least as far as the Shinigami go. The Asauchi, for those who don't know, are swords or blades which beginner Shinigami use and over time imprint their souls onto. The sword then gains a consciousness of its own, and in the most basic terms, the spirit of their Zanpakuto is a piece of their own soul. The blade is not a separate entity, but it does have its own soul. It is a physical manifestation of who the Soul Reaper truly is. But given the nature of the Zanpakuto, most of the Shinigami in the world of Bleach don't fully internalize this even if they understand it. It is very common to see the character treat their Zanpakuto spirit as a separate entity, a friend, a partner, a tool, or whatever Shunsui does with his, and no character profits from the mechanic of the Zanpakuto more than our favorite strawberry boy, Ichigo Kurosaki. The true nature of his powers, and by extension the understanding of himself, is one of the main conflicts he must battle with internally, especially during the Arrancar arc of the story. This conflict is what makes him one of the most compelling and interesting shonen protagonists we will ever see. While in the first arc of the story we don't really understand or really need to understand the source of his powers. When his powers are stripped from him by Byakuya, he undergoes proper Shinigami training with Kisuke. When we first see his inner world was during his training to attain his true Shinigami abilities. I'm sure this is the most popular form of foreshadowing when it comes to the true nature of Ichigo's Shinigami and Quincy powers, as well as the retroactive foreshadowing of Ichibei in the manga. When we take a look back at the conversation though, there are a few things I find interesting about the conversation between Old Man Zangetsu and Ichigo. Zangetsu opens the conversation by trying to tell Ichigo his name and notes how even though he has been trying, Old Man Zangetsu cannot reach Ichigo. It is also the first time we get a look inside Ichigo's inner world, which is something I wish we saw more of in other Shinigami, but regardless. In Kubo's infinite wisdom and foreshadowing, the first indication of Ichigo's Hollow and Shinigami powers being linked together are when he first appears in his true-ish Shinigami powers with a Shihakusho and a Hollow Mask, the true essence of his powers. And I don't need to tell you why this is narratively significant. It's the first indication that Kubo knew the direction he wanted to take Ichigo's character and the truth behind his soul from the very beginning. This awakening of his powers is the beginning of Ichigo's character arc in a spiritual sense. The power now allowing him to repay his debt to Rukia and prevent her from being executed for giving her abilities to a human. The next major time Ichigo encounters Zangetsu is during the Ryoka arc where he fights Kenpachi Zaraki. This fight has a very interesting dynamic and there are many parallels between the two. The entire fight, they are both knowingly or unknowingly treating their Zanpakuto as tools and not as an actual conscious entity they need to acknowledge. While Kenpachi just doesn't acknowledge his Zanpakuto at all, and they actually harm one another with their spiritual pressure. But in a similar way, Ichigo treated Old Man Zangetsu as a tool, and didn't really care about knowing him as a person, which is kindly and gently brought to his attention by White Ichigo, or White. In this group project that is Ichigo's soul, White is the second spirit inside Ichigo, the part of Ichigo's soul that was the hollow. White says the exact same words as Old Man Zangetsu upon meeting him. He comments that Ichigo should recognize him and know who he is better than anyone. White is literally Ichigo and yet is not at the same time. As Old Man Zangetsu puts it, and is something repeated about Ichigo's character throughout the entire Soul Society arc, is that the main opponent Ichigo needs to fight is actually himself. Up until this point, Ichigo doesn't try to understand his Zanpakuto and by extension himself. A fun little detail in White's words to Ichigo here, in quote, "Can you call a man your friend just because you asked for his name?" End quote, is that the question is meant to be a criticism of the way Ichigo is handling his power, but as a representation of his soul, the line could also be seen as White longing for Ichigo to understand him and by extension himself. As his Asauchi and Zanpakuto, White wants nothing more than for Ichigo to self-actualize. White's words have a hint of sadness in them upon a second viewing of the series, and it's understandable why. But now, being faced with the fact that he isn't giving Zanpakuto the care he deserves, Ichigo finds the first piece to the truth. He makes some headway, but still doesn't have a complete outlook on what it all means yet. He asks Zangetsu to fight with him. He wants to understand the source of his powers finally, something which visibly makes Zangetsu proud and happy. And then we get one of White's best forms of misdirection for the audience. He tells Old Man Zangetsu to take care of Ichigo, because someday that power will belong to him. And like I said, Ichigo's soul is a combination of Shinigami, Hollow, Quincy, Fullbring, and human. But later in the series, we discover that Zangetsu is truly a piece of Yhwach from 1,000 years ago. He also tells the audience and Ichigo that he purposefully suppressed most of Ichigo's Shinigami powers and became the center of Ichigo's powers. As Ichigo got stronger, it became more and more difficult to suppress the powers of the Hollow melded with his Shinigami powers. So, what White meant was that Old Man Zangetsu should take care of Ichigo, because one day he would be the center of Ichigo's powers and not him. Because the true Zanpakuto spirit is White. He is Zangetsu. In fact, the one who was always there in Ichigo's time of need, even as far back as Soul Society, was White. When he regains his Shinigami powers, the Hollow Mask is there. Even though Old Man Zangetsu is the one who is next to Ichigo in the final clash with Kenpachi, Ichigo's spiritual pressure still looks hollow-like. After his fight with Kenpachi, the Hollow Mask appears again, and finally, against Byakuya Kuchiki in their battle, the Hollow Mask appears once more. One thing I find interesting during the Bankai training in Soul Society arc was a single line by Ichigo. He recognizes that his soul is prone to depending on Zangetsu's power. Again, not being able to realize that this power he relies on is truly his own strength. Post Soul Society arc, Ichigo seems outwardly to be happy and confident in himself. He has friends, he saved Rukia, he has powers he never even dreamed possible, but deep down, he feels terrified of what he truly is. During the fight with Byakuya, the Hollow took over. White took over. In a sense, he fell victim to his inner and most violent instincts. The Rancor arc is the arc where Ichigo faces a lot of challenges in his identity, his trust in himself, and his faith in others as well. He fears the potential damage the Hollow could do, and since his return from Soul Society, the call and the voice of the Hollow seems to be getting louder. He tries to ignore it, but after his confrontation with Shinji and Aizen's Espada, Ulquiorra, and Yami, he realizes that it's not something he can ignore any longer. What Ichigo is going through here is suppression of his identity. Ichigo is someone who loves to fight. Battle is where he feels at home. It's something he does instinctually, but with the realization of what that instinct, what that Hollow could do, he tries to hold himself back so the beast within stays dormant. But this inner conflict in Ichigo actively hinders his ability to fight and protect. Ulquiorra notes that his spiritual pressure fluctuates so drastically that it can go from being trash to being higher than his own. The inner battle of Ichigo trying to use logic and his higher thinking in a sense, and do everything in his power to not succumb to the hollow. Self-rejection and refusing to accept yourself is notoriously one of the greatest nerfs you can place on yourself as a Shinigami in the world of Bleach. And so Ichigo must find a way to confront that part of himself, to control and use it without being a danger to himself or others on the battlefield, to integrate the shadow into his conscious being. And so, he seeks out Shinji Hirako and the Vizards or others on the battlefield, to integrate the shadow into his conscious being. And so, he seeks out Shinji Hirako and the Vizards for training. I keep harping on this point, but I think it's genuinely amazing how White literally spills the entire secret, if you can even call it that, of Ichigo's powers very early on in the series. Besides just freely admitting that both he and Old Man Zangetsu are his powers, and that they share a single body. But I think the fact that the answer was so obvious and yet it was so hard to believe goes a long way into allowing us as the reader to inhabit Ichigo's headspace a little bit. We are told verbatim that White is his true Zanpakuto spirit inside Zangetsu, but we are so against the idea that this entity that seems so malicious, bloodthirsty, and power-hungry could ever be part of Ichigo. But that's the point. This is who Ichigo is. White, the Hollow, is the true essence of his soul. It is here where White gives his famous instinct speech to Ichigo, the king and the horse. This speech has many different interpretations, but like most things having to do with Ichigo, you come away with two different messages depending on how many times you've seen the series. We were under the assumption at this point that the Hollow wanted to take over the body of Ichigo, and so the first time you hear this speech, it can feel like a threat to Ichigo. If he cannot make White submit and see him as the true king of that world, then White will take it for himself. Either Ichigo asserts dominance as the king, or one of equal strength, ability, and power will. But listening to it a few more times, knowing what we know now, the speech isn't really a threat in the same sense. White never intended to take the power all for himself, but rather he wanted to help push Ichigo along to understand the part of himself that craves battle, to not deny that part of himself nor fear it. Because to deny the Hollow would be to deny who he truly is. What White wants is not submission to Ichigo, but proper integration of this side of himself into his being. What White represents is very common among shonen inner demons. They are a part of the main character's self, which is driven by instinct and battle. One thing I don't think is often emphasized enough when I see discussions about this speech is that the king and the horse can only get as far together. A horse without a king has no direction. It has speed and power, but it is directionless in how to use it. A king without a horse has direction and a plan, but will never get as far as you could have with the horse. And I feel like that's kind of what White was trying to say. If anything, I think he was more frustrated at Ichigo for not realizing his full potential. He knows how strong he's supposed to be, and to see him limiting himself actually hurts Zangetsu, if anything. That hiding from the desire causes more harm than good in most circumstances. Now if we look at the Wako Mundo arc, Grimmjow and Ulquiorra being Ichigo's major opponents in that arc. Grimmjow is constantly talking about how he is the king. He talks about kingship. In his backstory as the Panther at Huchas, the other Hollows follow him like a pack leader. Grimmjow represents the philosophy that White described. He fights on instinct, he enjoys battle, and he refuses to hesitate. He is in many ways the horse that has already crowned itself king, which is exactly why he's such a good mirror for Ichigo Kurosaki. When Ichigo fights Grimmjow, they both start to enjoy the fight, especially Ichigo. They both start leaning into that instinct that White was telling him about. Grimmjow notices this shift in his fighting style, and he sees Ichigo finally fighting the way a Hollow should fight. Onlookers of the fight literally describe how they're both fighting like Hollows, like a Rancor. They're both leaning into their monstrous sides when fighting. But then comes the other half, Ulquiorra Schiffer. If Grimja represents instinct, then Ulquiorra represents nihilistic logic. Ulquiorra's philosophy is that the heart is meaningless. Hope, love, and faith, all of that is just an illusion to him. His aspect of death is despair, and he spends his entire conflict trying to prove that Orihime's belief in Ichigo is pointless. So if Grimja is the animal side of Ichigo's growth, Ulquiorra is the existential side. One of them pushed Ichigo towards his instinct and the other pushed him towards despair. But both of them are failed kings. Grimjaw wants to be king, but his kingship is purely instinctual. There's no restraint or reflection, he's all horse and no rider. Ulquiorra is the opposite. He is cold and reasoning. He's a detached observer. He studies the heart like a scientist examining a specimen. He's all rider and no horse. And this is where Ichigo sits. He has to navigate between them. And that's why the Arrancar arc works so well narratively. Grimjaw shows Ichigo the power of instinct, but Ulquiorra shows Ichigo the consequences of losing who you are. The Vasto Lorde moment happens between these two philosophies, but Grimjaw was wrong that instinct alone is what makes a king, and Ulquiorra was wrong that the heart is meaningless. The horse and the king must move together, and Ichigo has to pass through both. And the fact that Aizen intentionally put Grimjaw and Ulquiorra in Ichigo's path really goes a long way to proving that it wasn't all pointless or random battles. It was carefully designed for the evolution of Ichigo's hollow powers. Vasto Lorde Ichigo is possibly one of the coolest forms the character ever takes. He's the entire symbolism of the instinct speech finally made physical. The king was not able to fulfill his duty, so the horse continued where the king could not. But the Vasto Lorde transformation is where both White and Ichigo were correct in their outlooks. The lust for battle to defeat Ulquiorra, which validates White, but Ichigo cannot accept that he won the fight that way. It makes the victory feel hollow. Fighting with just logic and fighting with just instinct have their own individual flaws. A person is not just logic or instinct. You cannot be substantial if you do not cast a shadow. Ichigo must integrate this instinct into his logic. The king must be powerful enough to ride the horse. After the Ulquiorra fight, Ichigo is probably at his lowest point in the entire arc. He trusts himself and his powers even less now. He is afraid of hurting his friends like he did to Uryu, or how he frightened Orihime. He hesitates and feels powerless and loses all hope at the prospect of defeating Aizen, who is now fueled by the power of the Hogyoku, especially after most of the captains combined failed to put so much as a scratch on him. He isn't even supposed to be fighting in this war. He's 15 years old. How is he expected to beat the man who laid out death gods with hundreds of years of battle experience? It's really unfair and tragic if you think about it. What is he even doing here? He is just a child. But this is just who Ichigo is. First and foremost, Ichigo Kurosaki is a protector, a man who unwaveringly fights anyone who dares threaten the lives of those he cares about. Something he is reminded of by his father, and as hard as it was for him, in order to protect something, you have to lose something else. I think the training in the Dangai has to be some of the strangest and coolest things Kubo has ever done in the series. Strange because it's one of the most convenient storytelling for a training arc I've ever read. He literally went into like a hyperbolic time chamber for 3 months. The training in the Dangai is one of the most interesting and significant parts of Ichigo's relationship with Zangetsu. Isshin tells Ichigo that likely the only way to beat Aizen is with the final Getsuga Tensho, and to attain it he had to enter his own inner world and force his spirits inside to tell him how. Ichigo's final Getsuga Tensho is what I like to call his proto-Blade is Me. By accepting the blade of White Tensa, the combination of all the races inside of Ichigo, Ichigo gains transcendent spiritual pressure. He is also so powerful that not even Aizen in his 4th Hogyoku transformation can sense him. Ichigo becomes Getsuga itself, and what I meant by this is far more nuanced than one might think upon first viewing. And while I'm well aware that the technique is not a Quincy technique and is a Shinigami technique, Ichigo looks very, and I mean uncannily similar to Yuha Baha in this form. The long black hair, especially the red eyes that are reminiscent of Yuha's red almighty eyes, and well, I mean, Ichigo literally has a piece of the guy in his soul. But unfortunately, upon executing the technique, The price for this incredible power needed to perform Mugetsu, he must lose all of his Soul Reaper powers, seemingly saying goodbye to White and Zangetsu forever. Alright, I'm gonna end part one there. I will upload part two of this next week, but I need to, edit this and get it out to you. So that's why I'm splitting it up into two parts because editing everything would just be a little bit too much for me. But make sure you like and subscribe and hit that bell because then you'll be one of the first to know when I actually upload the part two of this video. Thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you could share the video, again, any support goes such a long way. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers and I guess that's all from me for this week. This has been Dufty. Bye.